In 1910, a man with no medical degree was handed the keys to American medicine. He was a school teacher from Louisville, Kentucky. He had never treated a patient, never set a broken bone, never studied for a single day inside a medical college. And yet within 2 years of his arrival, nearly half of the doctor training schools in the United States would be gone, not reformed, gone, their doors chained, their laboratories emptied, their names erased from the directories as if they had never existed. The schools that vanished first were not the worst ones. They were a specific kind. They were the ones that taught medicine from plants, from roots, from bark, from the pharmacology of the natural world that had been refined over 3 centuries on American soil. This is the story of how a single report, a river of oil money, and a quiet decade of decisions rebuilt an entire profession from the ground up. Some people call it the greatest reform in the history of healing. Other people call it a hostile takeover dressed up as science. The strange part is that both of those things can be true at once, and the paper trail that proves it was never hidden. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. It was just never read. I did not go looking for this. I went looking for something else entirely, the history of Standard Oil and the breakup of the monopoly, and I kept running into the same foundations, the same names, the same years, turning up in the history of medicine where I did not expect them at all. Once you notice the overlap, you cannot stop noticing it. The men dismantling a monopoly in oil were, at the very same moment, quietly assembling something that functioned like a monopoly in medicine and doing it with the language of charity and science. So I followed the money, and it led somewhere no textbook had ever pointed me. To understand what was taken, you have to understand what existed. Because the version of American medicine most people carry in their heads, the version where there was superstition and quackery and then suddenly there was science, is a story that was written by the winners. It is not what the country actually looked like. Go back to the year 1900. Walk into any American city of reasonable size, and you would find not one kind of doctor but several, competing openly, each with their own colleges, their own journals, their own hospitals, their own graduates hanging shingles on the same streets. There were the regulars, the ones who called themselves allopaths, the ancestors of the mainstream physician you see today. But they did not own the field, not yet. Standing directly beside them were the homeopaths, whose philosophy of minute doses filled entire universities. And beside them stood the eclectics. The eclectics are the ghost at the center of this entire story, so remember that word. Eclectic medicine was a distinctly American tradition. It grew out of the frontier, out of the practical knowledge of what actually grew in the fields and forests of this continent. Eclectic physicians built their pharmacology on the botanical, on black cohosh, on echinacea, on hydrastis, on lobelia, on hundreds of plant preparations catalogued, standardized, and taught with real rigor. This was not folk magic passed around a campfire. The Eclectic Medical Institute of Cincinnati was a functioning medical college that ran for nearly a century. Its faculty published thick pharmacology texts. Its chemists, men like John Uri Lloyd, were internationally respected. Lloyd was elected president of the American Pharmaceutical Association. He held patents. He was a working scientist by any honest definition of the term. The eclectics were not the enemy of medicine. They were a branch of it. Consider what the eclectics actually produced, because it tells you what kind of loss this was. Their great reference text, King's American Dispensatory, ran to more than 2,000 pages of detailed botanical pharmacology, dosages, preparations, and clinical indications, compiled and revised across decades. Lloyd and his brothers ran a pharmaceutical manufacturing house in Cincinnati that supplied plant-based medicines across the country and overseas. The library he built to hold the botanical and pharmaceutical literature of the world still stands in Cincinnati today, one of the great collections of its kind on the planet. This was an intellectual tradition with institutions, archives, standards, and working science behind it. When people imagine what was destroyed, they picture a wandering herb woman with a basket. What was actually destroyed was a documented, industrialized, university-backed system of botanical therapeutics. That is a very different thing to lose, and a much harder one to dismiss. And here is the number that matters. At the turn of the century, the United States had more medical schools than any nation on earth, more than 150 of them. The country was producing more doctors per capita than almost anywhere in the world, and a large and thriving share of those schools taught therapeutics that leaned heavily on botanical medicine. This was the landscape: crowded, competitive, diverse, loud, and in many places genuinely chaotic. That chaos is the crack that the entire operation would be driven through, so hold on to it. Because it is true, and this is the part that the natural medicine version of the story likes to skip, that a lot of those schools were bad. Some were outright fraudulent. There were what people at the time called diploma mills, storefront operations that would sell a medical degree to almost anyone with the tuition money and no real training behind it. There were schools with no laboratories, no cadavers, no clinical hospital access, professors lecturing from memory to rooms full of students who would graduate and go operate on human beings. That was real. The demand for reform was not invented. It was legitimate, and the public knew it, which is exactly why the operation worked. You do not sell a demolition by admitting it is a demolition. You sell it as a clean-up. You find a real problem, a rotten building on the block, and you use it as the reason to level the entire street, including the houses that were perfectly sound. The rot was the excuse. The reform was the cover, and the man they chose to hold the clipboard was chosen precisely because he could not tell the difference between the two. But there is a detail underneath the Flexner story that most tellings leave out, and it changes the color of everything. The American Medical Association had already done this survey itself. In 1904, the AMA created its Council on Medical Education, and by 1906 and 1907, its inspectors had quietly visited the medical schools and graded them, confidentially, into classes. They knew exactly which schools they wanted gone. The problem was optics. If the doctors' own trade association published a report condemning its rivals and demanding they be shut down, it would look like precisely what it was, a professional guild eliminating its competition. So the council did something clever. It went to the Carnegie Foundation and invited an outside, seemingly neutral body to conduct a public survey and publish the verdict for them. The AMA's own leaders helped guide the work. One of them travelled alongside the surveyor on the road. The independent investigation that the public trusted precisely because it came from a philanthropic foundation rather than from the doctors themselves was, in its origins, an operation the doctors had asked for and quietly steered. The neutrality was the product being sold. That was the whole reason to hire an outsider to hold the clipboard. His name was Abraham Flexner. In 1908 he was running a small private school in Louisville and had just published a book criticizing American colleges. That book caught the eye of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and its president, Henry Pritchett. Pritchett wanted a survey of every medical school in the United States and Canada. He did not hire a physician to do it. He hired Flexner, a man with a bachelor's degree in the classics and no medical training whatsoever. That choice was not an accident, and Pritchett said as much. An insider, a doctor, would have loyalties, would see nuance, would hesitate. What the Foundation wanted was an outsider who would apply a single fixed standard to every institution and feel nothing when it failed them. They wanted a blade, not a scalpel, and they got one. Flexner spent about 18 months on the road. He visited all 155 schools. He would arrive, often with almost no warning, spend a few hours walking the halls, count the laboratories, inspect the library, ask about entrance requirements and endowments, and move on to the next town. A few hours. That was the examination that would decide whether a school lived or died. And the standard he carried in his head, the yardstick he measured every one of them against, was a single institution, Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins had opened its medical school in 1893, and it was built on the German research model. Laboratory science first. Chemistry, biology, physiology, pathology, all grounded in bench research, full-time salaried faculty, a university hospital attached, strict entrance requirements demanding college coursework before admission. It was, for the training of laboratory researchers, a superb school. Flexner loved it. His own brother, Simon Flexner, was a product of that world and would go on to run the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. So when Abraham Flexner walked into a small eclectic college in the Midwest that ran on tuition, had no research endowment, and taught botanical therapeutics, he did not see a different philosophy of medicine. He saw a failure to be Johns Hopkins, and he wrote it down as such. The model Flexner worshipped had come from Germany. In the German universities of the 19th century, medicine had been rebuilt around the research laboratory and the teaching hospital, and figures like William Osler had carried that vision to Johns Hopkins and made it the American standard. There is no question the laboratory model produced extraordinary science. The argument was never that it was worthless. The argument is about what it cost to make it the only thing allowed to exist, and about who decided that a form of medicine that could not afford a research wing had therefore forfeited its right to teach at all. The report landed in 1910. Officially it was called Medical Education in the United States and Canada, Bulletin Number 4. History just calls it the Flexner Report. And it was a bomb. It named schools individually. It praised the handful that looked like Hopkins, and it eviscerated the rest by name, in print, for the entire country to read. It recommended that the number of medical schools in America be cut from more than 150 down to around 31. 31. It argued the country had far too many doctors, and that the solution was to shut most of the factories that made them. The report did something subtler than its headline recommendations, and it mattered more. It hardened a classification. Schools were effectively sorted into ranks, the acceptable, the doubtful, and the hopeless. That ranking became a currency. Foundations read it to decide where their grants would go. Licensing boards read it to decide whose graduates would count. A school's place in that hierarchy, decided in many cases by a few hours of one man's walk through the building, became the single fact that determined whether it would live or die. And nothing about that hierarchy was designed to measure whether botanical medicine actually worked on actual patients. It measured whether a school looked like Johns Hopkins. Now, if this were only about quality, you would expect the closures to fall on the fraudulent schools regardless of what they taught. Some of that did happen, and the diploma mills deserved to close. But watch which category of school was structurally doomed by the specific standards the report enforced, because this is the mechanism, and the mechanism is everything. Flexner's standard demanded enormous capital. It demanded expensive laboratories, full-time non-practicing faculty who drew salaries instead of income from patients, research endowments, and university affiliation. A small independent college funded by student tuition simply could not conjure that kind of money out of the air. The regular allopathic schools attached to wealthy universities could court the great philanthropic foundations to supply it. The eclectic and homeopathic colleges, standing outside that world, could not. The standard was not neutral. It was a filter, and it was shaped exactly like the schools that would survive it. And this is where the money enters the story. Because a report is only paper, paper does not close a building. What closes a building is the decision, made in a boardroom, about where tens of millions of dollars will and will not go. And in the years right after 1910, the largest concentration of private capital in human history turned its attention directly onto American medical education. John D. Rockefeller was, by most measures, the richest man who had ever lived. His fortune came from Standard Oil, the monopoly that controlled American petroleum so completely that the Supreme Court ordered it broken apart in that very same year, 1911. Rockefeller himself was famously drawn to homeopathy in his own private life. But the philanthropic machine built around his fortune, run by lieutenants like Frederick Gates, had no such sentiment. Gates was a former Baptist minister who had become the strategic mind of Rockefeller giving, and he believed with the force of religion in scientific, laboratory-based medicine. To Gates, the Flexner report was not a critique. It was a blueprint. Gates laid out his thinking in writing. He argued that medicine was on the verge of becoming a true science, and that a fortune placed behind laboratory research at the decisive moment could shape the direction of the entire field for a century. He was right about that. He was also, by his own logic, describing the acquisition of enormous influence over what medicine would become, purchased with philanthropy and paid for in gratitude. Rockefeller money would fund the institute that carried the family name, the schools that fit the model, and the public health campaigns that carried scientific medicine into every corner of American life. And the man who designed it understood exactly what he was buying. The vehicle was the General Education Board, a Rockefeller philanthropy chartered by Congress. And in 1913, the machine reached its final form with the founding of the Rockefeller Foundation itself. These were not small charities handing out coins. They were among the most powerful private institutions in the country, and they moved money at a scale that could reshape a profession. Over the following years, the Rockefeller boards and the Carnegie Foundation poured a staggering sum into American medical schools. By some accounts, the coordinated philanthropic investment ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars across the decades that followed. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. An almost unimaginable amount for the era. But the money came with a condition, and the condition is the whole game. The money went almost exclusively to schools that had adopted the Flexner model. Laboratory-based, research-oriented, allopathic. If your school taught that way, you could receive an endowment large enough to build a modern institution overnight. If your school did not, you got nothing, and you now had to compete against rivals who had just been handed fortunes. And here is the second turn of the screw. To receive the grants, schools often had to make structural changes that the foundations dictated. In the most direct cases, the money came with the requirement that a school shut down its instruction in the very therapeutics that defined the botanical and homeopathic traditions. You could take the money and stop being what you were, or you could stay what you were and starve. That was the choice. It was not a purchase in the sense of a signature on a deed. It was something quieter and far more effective. It was the redirection of every dollar in the room toward one model of medicine and away from every other. They did not need to buy the eclectic schools. They only needed to make it impossible to run one. Now add that third pressure at full force, because licensing is where the whole thing was sealed. In the years after the report, state medical boards, increasingly staffed and influenced by graduates of the newly favored institutions and the professional bodies aligned with them, began rewriting the rules for who could take the licensing exams. They tied eligibility to graduation from schools that met the Flexner standards, and they used the ratings produced by the American Medical Association's Council on Medical Education, working hand in glove with the survey, to decide which schools counted. A school could be rated so low that its graduates were simply barred from licensure in state after state. Think about what that does. It does not matter how good your botanical pharmacology is if your graduates cannot legally practice anywhere. Enrollment collapses. No student will pay tuition for a degree that leads to a locked door. And once enrollment collapses, the school dies on its own, and no one has to be seen holding the knife. So watch the eclectics fall. The tradition that had thrived for the better part of a century, that had produced respected chemists and standardized pharmacopoeias and hundreds of thousands of graduates, simply ran out of oxygen. School by school, through the 1910s and into the 1920s, they closed. Not in a single dramatic night. They close the way a forest is cleared, one tree at a time, until you look up one day and realize the whole stand is gone. By the middle of the 1920s, the landscape that had been so crowded and diverse just 15 years earlier was nearly unrecognizable. And the Eclectic Medical Institute of Cincinnati, the flagship, the last real fortress of American botanical medicine, held on longer than almost any of them through sheer stubbornness. It finally closed its doors in 1939. When it fell, the tradition it carried effectively fell with it. There was no longer a system to teach it, no accredited path to practice it, no funding to research it. An entire branch of American medicine had been pruned from the tree, and within a generation most people would not even remember it had ever grown there. Homeopathy is worth pausing on, because it shows how total the reversal was. At its peak, homeopathy in America supported more than 20 colleges, its own hospitals, its own well-funded medical societies, and a patient base that included some of the wealthiest families in the country. Hahnemann Medical College in Philadelphia was a large and respected institution, Boston University's medical school was homeopathic. These were not fringe operations. And yet within roughly 2 decades of the report, the homeopathic colleges had almost entirely either closed or quietly abandoned homeopathy to become conventional schools in order to keep their funding and their accreditation. A medical philosophy that had commanded universities and hospitals was, inside a single generation, functionally extinct as an institutional force in the United States. The speed of it is the tell. Traditions that lose fair fights fade slowly over the better part of a century. Traditions that lose their funding and their license to practice in the same decade die in 20 years. And the raw arithmetic is stark. The country went from more than 150 medical schools before the report to around 66 by the middle of the 1930s. More than half the medical schools in America were gone inside a generation, and the ones that vanished were overwhelmingly the small, the independent, the poorly endowed, and the unorthodox. The survivors were the ones the money chose. That is not a description of a market sorting winners from losers. It is a description of a market being sorted, deliberately, from above. Picture it from inside one of those schools. A college that has trained physicians for 40 years, that has faculty who wrote the textbooks in their field, that has graduates practicing in a dozen states. 1 year its rating slips. The next year a neighbouring state stops accepting its diploma for the licensing exam. Applications fall. The tuition that kept the lights on thins out. There is no grant coming, because grants go to the other model. The board meets, and meets again, and finally there is nothing left to decide. The doors close, the library is boxed up or sold off, the faculty scatter, and in the county histories, if the school is mentioned at all, it is mentioned as one of the substandard institutions that the Great Reform swept away. That single sentence, repeated across hundreds of towns, is how an entire branch of medicine disappears and is remembered as garbage that deserved the fire. That is the part that unsettles people the most when they first find it. Not just that it happened, but that it was forgotten so completely and so fast. The story was rewritten in real time. What had been a competing school of legitimate medicine became, in the official retelling, mere quackery that science had rightly swept away. The winners wrote the textbook, and the textbook did not mention that the losers had ever been anything but frauds. Now, before you decide this was a simple conspiracy, you have to be honest about the other side of the ledger, because the honest version is more disturbing than the cartoon. The Flexner reforms did real good. The diploma mills genuinely were dangerous, and killing them saved lives. Medical training in America did become vastly more rigorous, more scientific, more consistent. The germ theory of disease, sanitation, surgical antisepsis, and eventually the antibiotics and vaccines that flowed out of laboratory medicine represent some of the greatest achievements in all of human history. Millions of people are alive today because of the scientific medicine that this transformation entrenched. That is not propaganda. It is true, and any account that leaves it out is lying to you just as badly as the textbook that leaves out the eclectics. To be fair to that machine, some of what it bought was pure good. The Rockefeller philanthropies funded campaigns that all but eliminated hookworm across the American South and drove yellow fever and malaria back out of entire regions. That was laboratory scientific medicine at its finest, and it saved and improved millions of lives. The same apparatus that narrowed the profession also aimed real power at real diseases and won. None of this is simple. That is the entire point. It survived precisely because it was tangled, good, and self-interest wound together too tightly to pull apart. But look closer at the cost, because the cost was not only the herbalists. Flexner's standards, and the money that enforced them, deliberately reduced the total number of doctors in America. That was stated as a goal. Fewer schools, fewer graduates, a more exclusive and more expensive profession, and 2 groups paid for that exclusivity immediately. The report explicitly recommended that medical education for Black Americans be concentrated into just 2 institutions, effectively endorsing the closure of most of the historically black medical schools. 5 of the 7 were gone within years. Historians have estimated that this single decision suppressed the number of black physicians in America for generations, a shortfall measured in the tens of thousands of doctors who were never trained to serve communities that desperately needed them. Women's medical colleges suffered too, as the consolidation swept away many of the independent schools that had given women a path into medicine at all. The reform did not just remove the botanical tradition. It narrowed the entire doorway to who was allowed to become a healer in the first place, and it held that doorway narrow for decades. And then there is the question that the natural medicine world asks, and that the mainstream account refuses to engage with honestly. Why this model? Why did the men whose fortunes came from petroleum and industrial chemistry invest so heavily in a form of medicine built on synthesized, patentable compounds, at the direct expense of a medicine built on plants that no one could patent? You do not need to invent a secret meeting in a locked room to notice the alignment of interests. A plant cannot be patented. A molecule refined in a laboratory can be. Standard Oil sat on the raw feedstock of an entire coming century of pharmaceutical chemistry, the coal, tar, and petroleum derivatives from which countless drugs would eventually be built. A medical system oriented toward laboratory synthesized compounds was, whatever else it was, a system whose products could be owned, protected, and sold at scale. The men making these decisions were not fools. They understood incentives better than almost anyone alive. Whether the botanical tradition was destroyed because of that alignment or merely destroyed alongside it, the alignment itself is real, and it is documented in the ledgers, not in some fevered imagination. That is the uncomfortable middle where the truth actually sits. It was not a pure conspiracy, because the reformers genuinely believed in science and genuinely did enormous good. And it was not a pure reform, because the specific shape of the changes and the specific direction of the money served the financial interests of the people funding it with a precision that is very hard to write off as coincidence. It was both. It was self-interest and sincere belief braided so tightly together that even the men doing it may not have been able to tell them apart, which is exactly how the most consequential transformations in history usually happen. Not through villains twirling mustaches in the dark, but through powerful people who are convinced that whatever enriches them is also the thing that will save the world. Here is what should stay with you. Every piece of this is on the record. The Flexner report is a public document you can read tonight. The Rockefeller and Carnegie grant records exist. The dates of the school closures are catalogued. The founding of the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913, the General Education Board's disbursements, the confidential AMA gradings, the collapse of the eclectic colleges, the closure of the black medical schools, all of it is documented, sitting in archives and old bulletins that almost no one ever opens. The knowledge was not locked in a vault. It was hidden in plain sight, in the boring places, in the footnotes, and the annual reports, protected by the single most reliable security system ever devised, which is the near certainty that no one will ever bother to look. So the next time someone tells you that natural medicine was simply defeated by science in a fair fight, that the market chose the better product, and the herbalists lost because they deserved to, ask them one question. Who was writing the checks? Because a fortune the size of an ocean was directed, deliberately and in the open, toward one model of medicine and away from every other in the exact years that every other model happened to die. The schools are gone. The tradition is gone. The memory of it is nearly gone. But the receipts were never destroyed. Someone always keeps the receipts. And once you have seen them, you can never quite unsee the shape of what they paid to build, or the shape of everything they paid to make disappear.